Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to HOA and Karen Stories and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The sheriff stood on my deck, boots planted on wood I'd cut, sanded, and stained with my own hands, and told me my house didn't belong to me anymore. His finger tapped the paperwork once, firm and final. According to this map, he said, the structure is flagged for removal. 6 years of labor, every dollar I had saved. Every weekend I didn't rest, reduced to a thin pink line drawn by someone who had never lifted a hammer. They called it an administrative update. I knew better. That moment wasn't about paperwork. It was a declaration of war. But that wasn't the beginning. To understand why I didn't fold, why I didn't apologize or beg or quietly disappear, you have to go back to long before clipboards and orange vests ever showed up on my land. When I was a kid, I used to climb trees with a tool belt cinched too tight around my waist. I'd drag scrap boards up into the branches and wedge them between limbs, pretending I was building something permanent. Most of it collapsed within minutes, boards tumbling down into the dirt. I never saw that as failure. I saw it as instruction. Wood teaches you if you're willing to listen. It tells you when something is wrong, when something won't hold, when you've rushed instead of respected the work. By the time I was a teenager, I carried a beat-up copy of an off-grid living magazine everywhere I went. Other kids had comic books. I had floor plans and diagrams I barely understood. What I did understand was the idea that a person could build a life with their own hands and answer to no one but the land beneath their boots. People laughed when I talked about it. They said I'd grow out of it. They said life would get complicated. They were right about that part. I grew up. I built a construction business. I married a woman named Sarah who understood that silence could be just as meaningful as conversation. We had kids. We had bills, deadlines, the steady gravity that pulls most people away from the things they once believed in. But the dream didn't disappear. It waited. For nearly a decade, I restored homes for other people, old Victorians with sagging floors, forgotten craftsman houses layered with paint like tree rings. I fixed what time had broken, reinforced beams, squared doorways, made old things stand straight again. Clients called it work. I called it practice. Every night after the kids fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table sketching ideas in a notebook I never showed anyone. Rooflines, staircases, decks that caught the morning sun. Not houses meant to be flipped, but homes meant to be lived in. Friends told me I was chasing a fantasy. You don't have time. You don't have land. What they really meant was I didn't have permission. That was the one thing I never planned on asking for. By 2017, the noise got loud enough that even I started questioning myself. The business was steady, safe, comfortable. That's when the dream stopped being a dream and turned into a question. If not now, then when? I didn't want a vacation cabin or a weekend escape. I wanted land that demanded something from me, land that didn't care who I was. So when I stood at the edge of that canyon for the first time, wind pushing against my chest, cedar trees bending but not breaking, something settled deep in my bones. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't a midlife crisis. This was a promise I'd made to myself decades earlier and finally decided to keep. The land didn't come with a handshake or a gate or a realtor's smile. It sat 12 miles past the last stretch of pavement at the end of a road that barely deserved the name. Cell service vanished early. Common sense followed soon after. When I stepped out of the truck, the silence hit first. Not empty silence. Honest silence. Wind through cedar. A hawk circling somewhere above the canyon. 12 acres. Steep. Unforgiving. No utilities. No driveway. No water. No power. And, most importantly, no HOA. I didn't trust the view alone. I trusted the ground. I walked the property line that day by myself, scraping away dirt and pine needles until I found the iron survey pins driven deep into bedrock decades earlier. I checked each one against the deed folded in my pocket, north to south, east to west. They matched to the inch. These weren't suggestions, they were facts. Friends asked why I didn't buy something closer to town, easier access. Utilities already run. What they were really asking was why I didn't buy convenience. Because convenience comes with strings. This land came with none. I bought it because it was honest. No covenants hiding in fine print. No bylaws dictating mailbox styles or roof colors. Just dirt, sky, and responsibility. The day the paperwork cleared, I stood on the bluff again and imagined what could exist there someday. Not a mansion. Not a showpiece. A home that belonged to the mountain as much as it belonged to us. Something built slow. Built right. Built to last. The doubts came anyway. People reminded me I had no experience with heavy machinery, that it would take too long, cost too much, break my body before it ever stood upright. They weren't wrong. None of that felt like a reason to stop. It felt like a reason to start. I didn't hire contractors. I didn't ask for favors. I wanted the work to mean something. If the house was going to stand, it would stand on effort. The first night we camped there, the kids huddled close to the fire while darkness pressed in from all sides. Coyotes called from beyond the tree line, close enough to remind us we weren't in charge. Sarah looked at me, half smiling, half questioning, and asked if I was sure. I looked up at the stars, sharp and endless, untouched by anything man-made, and told her I had never been more sure. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know what it would demand. But standing there with iron pins beneath my boots, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I hadn't bought land. I had bought the right to build a life without asking permission. And I didn't yet know how hard someone else was going to try to take that away. The first year didn't feel heroic. There were no sweeping victories or cinematic moments, just slow progress measured in blisters, sore muscles, and exhaustion that sank into your bones the moment the sun went down. I started by clearing brush, cedar so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Every cut released a sharp, clean scent that clung to my clothes and skin. I carved out just enough space to work, just enough room to imagine where a foundation might someday sit. The mountain pushed back on everything. Every step slid. Every rock shifted. Nothing wanted to move unless it absolutely had to. When I rented the skid steer, the clerk warned me to take it easy on slopes like this. The first time I eased it onto the grade, my heart climbed straight into my throat. One wrong move and the whole machine would have rolled into the ravine below. I worked slow. Slower than anyone would recommend. Speed is for people who can afford mistakes. By the end of summer, I had something close to a level pad and a permanent respect for gravity. Year 2 was concrete. Rebar cut and tied by hand. Forms built, torn apart, rebuilt again. Trucks couldn't reach the site, so I hauled gravel in buckets. The second-hand cement mixer screamed every time I flipped the switch, like it resented being alive. I learned its moods quickly. When to push it. When to let it rest. My son, Ethan, helped when he could, passing tools with dirt-smudged hands and asking questions I didn't always have answers for. That part mattered more than the work itself. This wasn't just about finishing a house. It was about showing him how things are built when you don't quit halfway through. We slept in a tent that year. All 4 of us. The ground was never quite flat. Rain always found a way in. Raccoons treated our cooler like a personal challenge. Coyotes howled close enough some nights that sleep came in short stretches. Still, every morning we woke up right where we were supposed to be. Year 3 brought framing, and that's when the mountain finally started to understand what I was trying to do. The first beams went up crooked. I tore them down and did them again. Nothing stays square on a slope like this without a fight. Wind shoved ladders. Sun burned the back of my neck raw. I cracked a rib slipping on loose gravel and kept working anyway because stopping felt worse than the pain. By fall, the skeleton stood where there had once been nothing but rock and brush. I remember stepping back and seeing it for the first time, not as an idea or a dream, but as a shape that cast a shadow. That was when doubt showed up uninvited. People had warned me about that moment. They said this was where most folks quit, when the novelty wears off and the math stops working. When you start adding up how much time and money and life you've already poured into something. I kept going. Year 4 slowed everything down. Weather stalled us for weeks. Injuries stacked up. My business back home demanded attention. There were stretches when I couldn't make the drive at all. Every time I returned, the mountain looked at me like it was waiting to see if I'd finally given up. I hadn't. I salvaged cedar for the walls, boards aged and scarred, like they'd already lived a life before finding their way to me. I cut and fit each one by hand, nothing uniform. Nothing easy, the kind of work that forces patience whether you want it or not. The balcony rails nearly broke me. I forged them in my shop back in town on weekends, then hauled them up the mountain one piece at a time. Every switchback felt like a gamble. Every clank in the truck bed sounded like something expensive about to disappear into the canyon. Year 5 brought light, real light, real light. Solar panels went up beneath a sky so blue it looked fake. For years, we lived by lanterns and a generator that sounded like it ran on pure anger. The first night the system came online, the house didn't flicker or hum, it just breathed. My daughter, Lily, stood in her room staring at the light switch like it might betray her. When she flipped it and the room filled with steady warmth, she cried. I didn't. I stepped outside and stood under the stars, looking at the roofline etched against the night, feeling a kind of satisfaction that doesn't ask for witnesses. Year 6 felt like the finish line. Windows set. Floors sanded. The last stretch of reclaimed redwood siding I'd saved for years finally went up. Sarah joked that the place looked like a mountain museum. She wasn't wrong. Every mark had meaning. Every scar told the truth. This wasn't a house built fast or cheap. It was a house built honestly. That morning, I stood on the upper deck, applying the final coat of stain. The air smelled like cedar and solvent. Music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker balanced on a beam. For the first time in years, it felt like we were catching up to the dream instead of chasing it. I believed the hardest part was behind us. That's when I heard tires. Not distant, not imagined. Real engines where engines didn't belong. I frowned and looked down the slope. There was only one way up here, a narrow fire road I'd chained off myself. I hadn't heard the chain move. 4 vehicles crept into view, late model SUVs, spotless in a way that only happens when they never leave pavement. They parked neatly like someone had rehearsed it. 4 people stepped out, 3 men and 1 woman. Bright orange vests, navy lettering across the chest read, Highland Peaks, HOA. The woman took the lead, short, blonde hair. Sharp sunglasses. A clipboard thick enough to stop a brick if you dropped it. She walked up my drive like she owned the place. You must be Jack Callahan, she said, already flipping pages. I'm Karen Larson, Community Director for Highland Peaks. I climbed down slowly, hands still stained dark from the brush. I didn't offer my hand. You're about 6 years late to welcome me to the neighborhood. She smiled. The kind of smile meant to flatten resistance by pretending it isn't there. Actually, she said, tapping the clipboard, this parcel is no longer considered unincorporated land. She turned the clipboard toward me. A glossy digital map stared back. Pastel zoning blocks. Clean lines, my property outlined in black. Just enough of it shaded pink to matter. As of last August, she said, your western boundary falls within the expanded fire protection buffer zone of Highland Peaks. I stared at the map. The edge of my roof barely crossed into the pink. Surgical. Intentional. You're not listed as a registered member, she continued. Your architectural plans were never submitted for approval, which makes this structure non-compliant. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I'm not in your HOA, I said. I bought this land outright. Deed, title, taxes. Karen nodded slowly, like she was indulging a child. Developments expand, she said. Jurisdictions change. It's the property owner's responsibility to stay informed. She handed me an envelope. That was the moment I understood something important. They hadn't come to ask. They had come to tell. And standing there on the deck I'd built by hand, staring at a pink line someone else had drawn, I realized this house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a problem they wanted gone. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It came the way paper always does, quiet and confident, like it expects you to get tired before it does. 3 days after Karen left, the first envelope showed up, heavy stock. Glossy. My address printed clean and centered, like an invitation instead of a warning. Inside was a smiling pamphlet filled with trimmed lawns, happy families, and a suspiciously athletic deer frozen mid-leap. Across the top it read, Voluntary Integration Pathway. I read it once, then again, slower. The language was gentle, almost friendly, promising cooperation and flexibility if I agreed to bring my property into compliance. A 1-year grace period. Conditional exemptions. Architectural review assistance. It sounded generous until you understood what it really meant. Kneel now and we'll stop tightening the screws. On the back page, a deadline was circled in blue ink. 30 days. Beneath it, in smaller print, a warning about enforcement procedures, fines, access restrictions, and legal action if I failed to respond. That night, the pamphlet sat on my workbench next to a half-finished stair spindle. Cedar dust clung to the paper like it didn't belong there. I didn't sleep much, not because I was scared, but because I recognized the strategy. I'd seen it before. Paper doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It just waits, stacking pressure until most people fold because fighting feels exhausting. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Same pamphlet. This time, my name was printed across the cover, with a signature line waiting patiently at the bottom. A yellow sticky note was attached. Happy to discuss options, it read. Karen. By the end of the week, the letters multiplied. One from a law firm I'd never heard of, outlining potential fines for unpermitted development. Another citing updated fire mitigation guidelines. Different letterheads, same pink line. Sarah started stacking the envelopes by the door, not because she liked them there, but because she wanted to see how many there were. One night she asked quietly, so the kids wouldn't hear, how bad it was. I told her the truth. Not bad. Yet. That was the problem. Paper cuts don't hurt much at first. They just sting. But they bleed all the same. A week later, Karen sent a liaison. His name was Travis, early 30s. Shiny shoes that had never met gravel. He parked his hybrid SUV right at the edge of my retaining wall like it was a visitor space. He smiled a lot. Mr. Callahan, he said, extending a hand I didn't take. I'm with Highland Peaks Community Relations. Karen asked me to check in and see if you had questions about the voluntary pathway. I've got one, I said, still working a chisel into a cedar post. You folks always this persistent with land you don't own? He chuckled like it was a joke. He talked about fire risk, environmental responsibility, resale values. Words meant to sound reasonable while never quite saying what they wanted. He gestured toward the house. Your work up here is impressive, he said. Nobody wants to tear it down. I stopped chiseling. The silence landed heavy. I wiped the blade on my jeans and finally looked at him. Then stopped trying. His smile faltered just enough to notice. Our architectural committee is firm, he said carefully, but there's flexibility if you're willing to cooperate. I'm not signing anything, I said. And if you come back without a court order, I'll file trespass. He nodded, smile thinner now. Karen was hoping you'd be more cooperative. Tell Karen I cooperate with people who stay off my property. He left without argument. That worried me more than anger would have. They were patient. They believed time would do their work for them. That's when I decided to go public. I didn't do it for attention. I'm not wired for spectacle. But paper isolates you. It keeps the fight quiet until you start to feel like you're the only one in the room. One night, after the kids were asleep and the house settled into its familiar creak, I sat at the computer and told the story straight. No music. No edits. Just 6 years of photos, timestamps, and documents. A calm explanation of how a home built by hand suddenly became non-compliant because a pink line appeared on a map. I posted it and shut the laptop. By morning, it had moved. Messages poured in from people I didn't know. Retired builders, surveyors, veterans, homeowners who had fought similar battles and lost more than they wanted to admit. They weren't loud. They were tired. By the second day, the comments turned into something else, less like the internet and more like a town hall that had finally found its microphone. People shared records, pointed me toward public filings, explained how overlays worked when they were done honestly. One comment crossed a line. A dark joke about bears and coyotes and problems disappearing into the woods. It wasn't a plan. It was frustration turning feral. I deleted it immediately and left a response of my own. This ends with the truth, not threats. A few people accuse me of being soft. They were wrong. The moment a fight stops being about what's right and starts being about what feels good, you lose control of it. The HOA noticed. Screenshots circulated. Someone tried to suggest I was inciting hostility. That didn't stick. The record showed I shut it down. A local freelance reporter reached out and asked to hike up and see the place. I agreed on one condition. No drama, just documents and daylight. When he stood on the deck and saw the pink line barely clip the roof, his expression changed. Who benefits if this house goes away, he asked. I didn't answer. I just pointed toward the ridge. That question followed me long after he left. I went back to the map Karen had shown me. It was too clean, too perfect. Real land doesn't behave that neatly. I pulled my original survey from 2017 and spread it across the kitchen table. Then I printed the HOA overlay, the county parcel layer, and the tax assessor map. Side by side, the trick revealed itself. The overlay existed, but the tax layer hadn't changed. No new district code, no adjusted assessment, no effective date that matched the claimed expansion. You don't get jurisdiction without revenue. Authority without taxation is theater. I checked the GIS metadata. Edit history. Timestamps. The overlay had been added in a single update window. No public hearing reference. No assessor sign-off. Not sloppy. Surgical. That afternoon, I walked the property again and scraped dirt away from the survey pins. They were still there, sunk deep into bedrock, exactly where they'd been set decades earlier. I stood on the bluff and traced the ridgeline in my mind, then pulled up the county planning portal when I got home. That's when I found it. A proposed development packet filed under a name I didn't recognize at first. Creekside View. Glossy renderings. Phrases like elevated living and panoramic canyon experience. One image stopped me cold. A clubhouse perched on a ridge. Glass railings. Infinity edge deck. Morning light spilling across the canyon. My ridge. My house wasn't in the image. It had been erased. A caption read, "Unobstructed western views reserved for premium lots." The pink line wasn't a mistake. It was a wedge. They didn't want my house. They wanted what my house was standing on. Once you see the lie clearly, you stop arguing with it. You start dismantling it. I printed everything and stacked it into a folder thick enough to bend at the corners. Original deed. Survey photos. GIS layers. Creekside view renderings. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. Because lies like that can't survive daylight. And the daylight was just beginning. The pressure sharpened after that. It stopped pretending to be polite and started acting like it was running out of time. Deadlines tightened. Language shifted from suggestions to instructions. Emails arrived late at night and early in the morning, as if urgency alone could create authority. Then the sheriff came back. Same truck, same steady posture. Different tone. He parked closer this time, like distance itself was under negotiation. Karen arrived moments later, sunglasses already on, clipboard tucked under her arm. I met them on the deck, the wood still damp from the morning mist. "There's an occupancy issue we need to clarify," the sheriff said. Karen didn't wait. "We've received multiple safety complaints," she said quickly. "Unapproved habitation inside HOA territory." "This house isn't occupied," I said. "It's under construction, and it's not in your HOA." She slid a map forward. "According to the updated overlay." "That overlay doesn't change tax jurisdiction," I said calmly, "and it doesn't move iron pins." The sheriff looked down at the map longer than before. Then he did something small that told me everything. He took off his sunglasses. He traced the coordinates with his finger, slower now. "Which office approved this expansion?" he asked. Karen smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The planning committee." "Then it'll be easy to verify," he said. She pivoted immediately. "Sheriff, we're not here to debate mapping theory. We're here to prevent liability." I handed him the folder. He opened it and went quiet. Photos of the survey pins. Deed records. Tax layers with unchanged district codes. He didn't rush. Karen noticed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, trying to regain control. "This doesn't need to escalate," she said. That's when it escalated. 2 days later, anonymous complaints hit the county. Fire violations, environmental disturbance, structural hazards. A preliminary fine estimate arrived by email, $125,000. Then came drone photos of my house from angles I hadn't flown, framed to exaggerate slope and risk, stripped of context and labeled encroachment. The sheriff returned again, this time with a deputy. No lights, no sirens. "Just procedure. We're issuing a notice of voluntary vacation," he said. 72 hours. Karen stood behind him, satisfied. "Temporary," she added. "Until compliance is resolved." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I watched the sheriff hesitate just a beat too long, his eyes drifting back to the ridge beyond the deck, the view that had started all of this. That night, the emails multiplied. Different agencies, different letterheads. Same choreography. I forwarded everything to one person. A land use attorney named Margaret Lewis. She didn't waste time. "Email me everything," she said. "And don't say another word to them." 10 minutes after I sent the file, my phone rang. She paused before speaking, not silent, processing. "I charge $400 an hour to find mistakes like this," she said. "You just handed me the smoking gun." She walked through it methodically. The overlay wasn't registered as a taxable jurisdiction. No revenue filings, no authority. At best, posturing. At worst, fraud. She drafted a cease and desist that same day. Clean. Clean. Surgical. No emotion. Then she filed an audit request with the Department of Revenue for Highland Peak's boundary expansion. That wasn't a lawsuit. It was a mirror. Karen's response came fast. She didn't dispute the facts. She accused me of being uncooperative. 2 days later, the Department of Revenue acknowledged receipt. That's when the noise changed. Deadlines softened. Threats turned into pauses. The sheriff didn't come back, and then the story broke wider. A local station aired a 10-minute segment. No music. No drama. Just maps, documents, and a drone shot that made the geometry undeniable. The headline asked the only question that mattered. Who owns the ridge? Emails flooded the county. Former HOA members wrote in, confused and angry. One message stood out. I thought the buffer was about fire safety. No one told us about the clubhouse. Margaret called that night. They flinched, she said. That's not victory, but it's real. 3 mornings later, black sedans pulled up to the HOA office down the road. No clipboards this time, no vests. Karen stepped out smiling, already reaching for control. It lasted seconds. She laughed when they told her she was under arrest. Then the charges were read. Fraud, falsification of public records, attempted unlawful property seizure, tax evasion, conspiracy. Each word stripped the polish away. As they cuffed her, she twisted toward me across the distance. That house was an obstacle, she snapped. Nothing more. Obstacle. The sheriff walked over after the cars left. He took off his sunglasses again. I owe you an apology, he said. The coordinates never sat right. I should have pressed harder. Paper only works when no one checks the pins, I said. He nodded once. Your title stands. Clean. All enforcement tied to that overlay is frozen. The HOA dissolved within weeks. Board members resigned. The GIS consultant turned over emails and drafts. An injunction voided the expansion. Compensation followed, enough to cover costs and damage you can't itemize. I didn't celebrate. I walked the house instead. Touched the rails we forged by hand, the beams we reset 3 times. Outside, the canyon caught the last light of day, the same way it always had. Later, I built a small observation tower on the ridge. Nothing flashy, just wood and steel, high enough to see the canyon open wide. From up there, the view is honest. No glass railings. No infinity edges. Just air and distance and perspective. Months later, I held a small open house. Friends. Neighbors. A few former HOA members who looked relieved to finally see the ridge without brochures lying to them. I pinned Karen's old overlay map to a board and titled it, How to Lose Everything. Beside it, my original deed, framed in steel. On the gate, I hung a hand-painted sign. This is private land. This house was built by hand. Trespassers will be educated. Freedom lives here. The calls still come in. Stories from across the country. Quiet lines on maps. Soft deadlines. Pressure dressed as procedure. I help where I can. Not by shouting. By teaching people where to look. Because the truth is simple. Most power survives by staying quiet. Most theft happens on paper, and most people lose because they get tired. I didn't win because I was loud. I won because I didn't disappear. If this story matters to you, if you've ever felt pushed by paperwork or threatened by people who count on silence, make sure to like this video, subscribe to HOA and Karen Stories, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because the moment people stop disappearing quietly, lines stop moving.